why I do not believe in hell, fire, or eternal conscious torment or anything of the sort. Now, this is not going to be an exhaustive Bible study, but I'm going to hit the major points. The first thing we need to get out of the way is, where in the world did the word hell even come from? It's not in the original languages of the Bible. It infamously appears in English translations of the Bible. It turns out that hell is a woman. No, that's not a joke. She was a Norse pagan goddess of the dead who ruled the underworld of the dead, named after her. So in old Germanic talk, go to hell meant go die. But even in this pagan legend called hell, it didn't mean fire. English is a Germanic language, so I would like to give the early English translators of the Bible the benefit of the doubt on this. There was no word like the Hebrew word Sheol in Germanic languages, so the closest thing they could find was this pagan legend called hell. That's how we got the word hell. I think that was lamentable and was a mistake. And they should have just used the Hebrew word Sheol, the Greek Hades, and we would have been forced to learn what those words actually mean, instead of having this sort of artificial imposed word with a different sort of meaning imposed on the English text. So the next thing we need to figure out is, how in the world did hell, a Norse goddess, a place of the dead, become eternal fire in the Bible? Throughout the entire Old Testament, God never warns anybody of a place of eternal fire and eternal conscious torment and fire, ever in the Old Testament. It's not in the law of Moses. It's not in the prophets. God never told Adam and Eve that if they sinned, they're going to be burned forever in fire. God said the penalty for sin is death. If you eat of this tree, you will die. And he never said, oh, and by the way, after you die, I'm going to wake you up and roast you in fire forever and ever. So that's a huge omission in the Old Testament, I would say. Now, the earliest very successful translation of the Bible into English was the King James Bible. And the King James translators translated the words Sheol, the Hebrew Sheol, and the Greek Hades, as hell. And these words merely mean the abode of the dead or the grave. And as I explained, this concept of hell, this Germanic concept of hell, really only meant the grave, the abode of the dead. Nothing related to fire or eternal torment whatsoever. The phrase hellfire was introduced into the King James Bible in Matthew 5:22. But this time, the word they were translating was the Greek word Gehenna, which was the Hebrew valley of Hinnom. This was a place of judgment in the Old Testament. And at the time of the New Testament, it was a place where they burned the trash. Now, this was seen as a cursed place by the Jews. In Jeremiah chapter 19 and Jeremiah chapter 7, we read that God's judgment of destruction came upon Israel in this valley of Hinnom, because they were sacrificing their babies to this pagan god Baal, literally burning their own children in the fire. So Jeremiah predicted this would become the valley of slaughter, and the bodies of these very wicked Israelites would be put there to rot. Now combine this with the same valley of Hinnom, this word Gehenna that is translated as hell, in Jesus' time being a place where they were burning the trash. So it's a place of fire, death, and destruction here on earth. So Gehenna was a place of judgment and destruction in the Old Testament, much the same as Sodom was a place of sudden judgment and destruction. So Christ could have just as easily said, you shall be in the danger of the fire of Sodom. And it would have had the same meaning. Just like Sodom was not a dwelling place of the dead, neither was the valley of Gehenna. So when the English translators took this word Gehenna and translated it hell, the dwelling place of the underworld of the dead, you can see how this completely changes the meaning of that passage. Hellfire now means eternal conscious torment, a dwelling place of the dead, where fire is. And it's just completely nonsense. That's not what that passage meant at all. Just like in Jeremiah chapter 19 and Jeremiah chapter 7, Gehenna, the Valley Hinnom, merely means a place of judgment and destruction. So like I said, Jesus could have used the word Sodom to make the same point. You'll be in the danger of the fire of Sodom. And you would immediately recognize that this was a place of sudden destruction, judgment, and death here on earth, not a dwelling place of the dead in fire. So nowhere in the Old Testament the word Sheol does not mean a dwelling place of fire or eternal torment. The word Hades, which is the equivalent of Sheol in the New Testament, also doesn't mean an eternal dwelling place of fire. And the word Gehenna, that is translated in the Bible as hell, also does not mean an eternal dwelling place of fire. So that leaves only one word left in the New Testament that is also translated as hell. And this is the Greek word Tartarus. And interestingly, this actually was a place of fire in pagan Greek poetry and mythology. So let's look at that real quick. In Greek poetry, there was a river of fire called Phliathon that flowed into this underworld of Tartarus, which was the prison of the Titans and a place where the wicked dwelled. And the idea of hellfire was actually a pagan creation, not a Jewish or Christian creation. So this word Tartarus is used in one place in 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 4, where the angels who sinned are depicted as being imprisoned in Tartarus, translated as hell. Peter is using this as a literary device for a Greek audience who would have understood this. The angels are spirits, and therefore they do not die like humans do, lest they don't go to the grave, Sheol or Hades. They are put in a prison, and that is exactly what Tartarus is in Greek thinking. It's a prison for bad spirits. And so Peter is using an accessible idea that his audience would understand, that they are being imprisoned by God. But even this Greek idea of Tartarus didn't mean eternal punishment in fire. It's actually depicted as more of like a dungeon, a prison, a place where people are locked up. So even though there was this river, Phliathon, this river of fire that flowed into this underworld Tartarus, which was a prison for the Titans and wicked spirits and so forth in Greek thinking, it actually wasn't viewed as a place of eternal punishment in fire. It was viewed as a dungeon, a dark, gloomy dungeon. And so this is what Peter is saying, that these angels are being put in prison. And even that wasn't permanent. It was they were being detained in prison, held back. And that was his point. And so finally, we are left with this lake of fire in the book of Revelations. Now, the lake of fire really just means destruction, because we see that death and Hades, that death itself is thrown into this lake of fire. And you sort of draw this imagery of angels and people being thrown into the lake of fire and seeing this as them, swimming in this lake of fire and burning forever because the smoke of their torment rises forever. Well, that doesn't mean that they're tormented in fire forever. That just means the sign of this destruction will be forever. This will be remembered forever. Remember, death itself is thrown into this lake of fire, and death is not an object that can be thrown into fire. So it's very allegorical, metaphorical. It's an image of destruction. And so we see that the last thing to be thrown into this lake of fire, this place of destruction, total destruction, is death itself. The idea that death itself is going to be completely destroyed by Christ. It will no longer have a hold on us. Death is gone forever, burned up in fire completely. So that pretty much mops up all these verses in the New Testament where we get this idea of eternal conscious suffering with fire. And so the only thing that you could point to maybe now is this parable of Lazarus and the rich man, where the rich man says, to Abraham, send Lazarus to dip his finger in the water and touch my tongue because I'm tormented in this flame. And so we have this parable where you kind of imagine this dwelling place of fire. But again, this parable, the point of this parable has nothing to do with a dwelling place of fire. This parable is actually contrasting the Jewish people, the descendants of Isaac, with the servant of Abraham in the Old Testament, Eleazar. The word Lazarus is basically the New Testament equivalent, shorthand of Eleazar. And Eleazar was going to be the heir of Abraham's fortune if Isaac hadn't been born. And then God said, "No, you're going to have a son, and he will be your heir." And so what's going on in this parable is Jesus is reversing the fortune. He's saying the inheritance is going back to Eleazar. So the whole point of this parable is that the gospel message is going to be received by the Gentile descendants of this righteous servant Eleazar, and the Jews are going to reject this. And this is going to be a horrible reverse of fortune. The true riches of God's kingdom is going to be given to those who receive the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And so Christ is using hyperbolic language to show how bad this is going to be. The huge contrast of not being close to God. And that is the point of the parable, not that there's this place of eternal fire, but that this reversal of fortune is going to be terrible for the Jewish people. They're not going to be close to God. They are not going to be heirs of the kingdom of God, the true riches of God. Now, I could do an entire teaching dissecting this parable alone, this parable of Lazarus and the rich man. But suffice to say, the parable is hyperbolic language showing this horrible reverse of fortune, that the riches of God's inheritance, the promise to Abraham, will be going to somebody else. And this is a terrible, terrible reverse of fortune for those who are missing the Messiah, who are rejecting the Messiah. And that's the gist of the parable, and we could really, really dissect this parable in a big way. But that would be a different teaching. But suffice to say, this parable is not a teaching of eternal conscious torment and fire. The parable has a completely different point. And there is so much going on in that parable, so much, and it would be really a good study just to focus in on that one parable. But that is not the point of this teaching. Right now, I'm making a strong point to you that this idea of hellfire, eternal conscious torment and fire, does not exist in the Bible. There's not even a hint of it in the Old Testament. And the only way we get this in the New Testament is through mistranslations into English and misinterpretations of hyperbolic language. So there is no eternal dwelling place of eternal torment and fire. What Christ came to save us from was death. Christ came to destroy death and to give us life. And that is the whole point of the gospel message, that Christ has defeated death, that Christ has destroyed death, and he has the keys to death and Hades, and that he can unlock the door, so to speak, and bring us back to life. So I hope this information was useful to you. Thank you for watching, and God bless you. Bye-bye.